The silence of a nursery is supposed to be peaceful, a quiet sanctuary where a sleeping toddler rests before another day of discovery. But on a cold morning, that silence became a heavy, suffocating shroud over the life of 2-year-old Lily Mae Johnson. There were no sirens initially, no immediate crime scene tape wrapped around the front porch. There was only a devastating finality that something profoundly precious was gone. Lily Mae was a child born into turbulence. Her fragile existence caught in the complex web of the state system almost from her first breath. She had wide, observant eyes and a hesitant smile that social workers noted in their brief, hurried reports. She was a toddler who had already learned to navigate the world quietly, adapting to the shifting faces and unfamiliar bedrooms that defined her incredibly brief journey on this earth. When the paramedics finally arrived at the residence, the emergency response was swift but ultimately futile. Within days, the official paperwork was stamped, and the medical examiner handed down a rapid conclusion that closed the book on the toddler. Her passing was officially ruled as sudden infant death syndrome, commonly known as SIDS. The case was quietly filed away, classified as an unavoidable tragedy rather than a matter requiring deeper police scrutiny. That swift closure provided a convenient shield for a child welfare agency already buckling under the immense weight of overwhelming caseloads. The bureaucratic machinery moves rapidly when a death is labeled an accident, shifting focus to the thousands of other living dependents waiting in the queue. SIDS offered an airtight medical explanation that required no further investigation, no uncomfortable interviews, and crucially, no institutional accountability for the environment where she took her last breath. But the reality of her environment was a deeply unsettling narrative of instability. By the time she was 24 months old, she had already been placed in her 5th foster home. 5 different families, 5 different sets of rules, 5 different beds in a timeline where most toddlers are just learning the comforting routines of a permanent home. This relentless uprooting stripped away the consistent care and secure attachments fundamentally necessary for a developing child. For independent advocates and former caseworkers who refused to let the file gather dust, that SIDS ruling felt deeply incongruous. They knew that sudden infant death syndrome is exceedingly rare in 2-year-old children, typically affecting infants under the age of 1. This medical anomaly became the initial thread that independent investigators began to pull, fighting against the heavy inertia of a State Department that had already declared the matter resolved and firmly shut. The breakthrough came not from a dramatic confession, but from a painstaking secondary review of her scattered medical records. When pediatric specialists and investigative advocates finally obtained the complete file, a chilling pattern emerged from the clinical notes. The documents revealed a history of prior injuries that had been treated at different urgent care clinics over the previous 8 months. There were unexplained bruises, a hairline fracture, and repeated visits for vague, undocumented accidents. These critical warning signs were entirely missed by the oversight mechanisms designed to protect her. Because she was bounced from home to home, her medical history was fragmented, treated by different doctors who never saw the complete, terrifying picture. Caseworkers, burdened by impossible quotas, accepted superficial explanations for these injuries, checking boxes on mandatory visitation forms without pausing to connect the dots of a child who was clearly in escalating physical danger. The profound tragedy lies in the absolute isolation she must have felt. A silent suffering endured by a toddler without the vocabulary to ask for help. Every bruise was a desperate plea that went unanswered by the adults assigned to be her guardians. For those who survived the foster system, her story is a haunting reflection of their own childhood vulnerabilities, a stark reminder of what happens when the safety net is riddled with gaping holes. The environment of that final placement warrants rigorous scrutiny. The 5th foster home was a high-turnover household, frequently utilized by the agency for emergency placements due to a severe shortage of available beds in the county. On the night of the incident, witness testimony from other children in the home suggested a chaotic atmosphere, an environment where supervision was dangerously thin and the needs of a vulnerable 2-year-old could easily be overlooked or ignored. Untangling the events of that specific night proved incredibly difficult for those seeking the truth. The primary witnesses were either defensive caregivers or traumatized minors whose testimonies were understandably fragile. Investigators had to rely heavily on the rigid, uncompromising truths found in the physical evidence, contrasting the caretaker's timeline of a peaceful sleep with the forensic reality of a child who had suffered documented, compounding traumas in the weeks leading up to her death. The deeper investigation illuminated a catastrophic failure of standard operating procedures within the Child Welfare Agency. The pressure to place children quickly often overrides the necessity for rigorous vetting and consistent monitoring of foster homes. When beds are scarce, standards inevitably slip. The agency prioritized physical placement over emotional and physical safety, creating a perilous environment where high-risk homes were repeatedly utilized simply because they had an open room and a willing signature on the contract. Outrage began to simmer as these hidden details leaked to child advocates and biological families who had lost their own children to the system. They formed a vocal coalition, protesting outside administrative buildings and demanding a formal re-examination of the autopsy results. Their collective voice transformed a forgotten file into a glaring spotlight on institutional negligence, refusing to accept the convenient narrative that a perfectly healthy toddler simply stops breathing without a discernible cause. Medical experts brought in by the advocacy groups argued fiercely against the original findings. They pointed out that true SIDS is a diagnosis of exclusion, used only when all other potential causes of death, including neglect and inflicted trauma, have been entirely ruled out. Given the documented history of prior injuries and the chaotic nature of the household, applying the SIDS label was not just medically improbable, it was a profound dereliction of forensic duty. The weight of this medical negligence falls heaviest on the memory of the little girl who endured it. She was treated not as a precious human life requiring fierce protection, but as a logistical problem to be solved, a file to be shuffled from one desk to another. Her inherent right to safety was compromised by every adult who looked at her fading smile and chose the path of least administrative resistance. Unsurprisingly, the state apparatus moved defensively to protect its reputation and its funding. Agency representatives cited privacy laws and ongoing internal reviews as reasons to withhold further documents from the public eye. This bureaucratic stonewalling is a common tactic, utilizing the very laws designed to protect a child's privacy as a thick, impenetrable shield to hide the systemic failures that ultimately led to that child's entirely preventable demise. Despite the stonewalling, leaked internal agency reports eventually surfaced, providing undeniable proof of the missed red flags. These internal audits showed that caseworkers had actually documented concerns about the fifth foster home's capacity to provide adequate care weeks before the tragedy, yet no action was taken to remove the vulnerable toddler from the residence. The reports proved that the danger was not invisible. It was simply ignored by a system paralyzed by its own dysfunction. The revelation of these ignored warnings shifted the narrative from a tragic accident to a case of gross systemic negligence. It forced a painful public reckoning with the reality that the very institution tasked with saving children was actively placing them in the crosshairs of danger. The community was left to grapple with the horrifying truth that her death was not an unpredictable act of nature, but the foreseeable outcome of institutional apathy. For the seasoned investigators and former foster youth driving this push for justice, the case is deeply personal. They see their own faces in her photographs, recognizing the distinct, quiet terror of being entirely dependent on strangers who may not have your best interests at heart. Their relentless pursuit of the truth is fueled by a desperate need to validate her existence, to prove that her short life held immense value and demanded fierce protection. The legal battle to officially overturn a death certificate is an arduous, uphill climb through a dense thicket of judicial precedent. It requires overwhelming, undeniable proof to force a medical examiner to amend a ruling from accidental to undetermined or potentially homicide. Advocates must navigate a complex legal system that inherently favors the original official findings, requiring them to build a flawless evidentiary chain years after the physical evidence has been buried or destroyed. This grueling legal fight underscores a much broader national crisis regarding the oversight of vulnerable dependents. Across the country, underfunded and understaffed welfare departments are making life or death decisions in a state of perpetual triage. The reliance on undervetted homes and the rushing of placements are not isolated anomalies. They are the standard operating procedures of a broken apparatus that fundamentally devalues the lives of the marginalized children it is legally mandated to serve and protect. The legacy of this heartbreaking case extends far beyond the confines of a single county courthouse. It has become a rallying cry for systemic reform, inspiring new legislation aimed at increasing transparency and establishing independent oversight boards for child fatalities. The memory of that quiet toddler is now a powerful catalyst for change, ensuring that other children might be spared the terrifying instability and profound neglect that defined her fleeting time in the system. Ultimately, this investigation forces society to critically examine the true definition of an accident. When a system repeatedly places a child in harm's way, ignores documented injuries, and turns a blind eye to chaotic environments, the resulting tragedy cannot be dismissed as a mere twist of fate. It is a systemic failure of the highest order, a predictable catastrophe born from a collective refusal to prioritize the safety of the most vulnerable among us. The fight for Lily Mae Johnson is far from over. It is a continuous, relentless demand for accountability in a world that too often looks away from the shadows. Her story remains a poignant reminder that true justice requires us to question the official narratives, to dig beneath the surface of convenient rulings, and to stand fiercely as the voice for those who were silenced long before they ever had the chance to speak their truth.